Welcome to English Insight. Today, I want you to imagine a scenario where you are listening to English at full speed. Whether it's in a conversation, a lecture, a podcast, or even a movie, and you understand everything effortlessly, without pausing, without confusion, and without feeling lost. I know that many English learners struggle with understanding spoken English in real life because native speakers talk fast, use slang, change intonation, or mix accents, and it can feel overwhelming, frustrating, and even discouraging at times, especially when you feel like you are putting in hours of study, but still can't follow conversations naturally. But I promise you, by the end of this video, you will know 10 advanced listening secrets that will completely transform the way you comprehend English. These are practical, actionable strategies that real learners use to improve their understanding and fluency, and I'll guide you step by step, showing how to apply them in everyday situations, whether it's at school, at work, or when chatting with friends. Imagine being able to tune into a podcast and catch every key point, or follow a fast-paced discussion in a TV show, or even understand announcements in different accents without panicking. And picture yourself feeling confident and proud because now English listening feels natural and enjoyable rather than stressful. Today, you will not just learn tips. You will practice techniques that involve listening actively, predicting meaning, focusing on important words, noticing intonation, understanding context, distinguishing similar sounds, and much more. These strategies are designed to improve comprehension, build fluency, and increase confidence, which means you'll be able to communicate more effectively, participate actively in conversations, and enjoy content in English without relying on subtitles or translations. So stay with me, take notes if you like, and get ready to discover the 10 secrets that will help you become a confident, fluent, and skilled listener in English, because mastering advanced listening is not only about understanding words. It's about understanding meaning, context, and intention, and by the time we finish, you'll have the tools to listen like a pro, follow conversations effortlessly, and transform your English skills in real-life situations. Let's begin this journey together. And by the end, you'll feel inspired, motivated, and ready to practice these secrets immediately in your everyday English encounters. Now let's dive into the first secret. Focus on keywords, because this is one of the most powerful ways to improve your English listening immediately. Imagine a woman navigating a busy city street, trying to ask strangers for directions while traffic, noises, and multiple conversations surround her. And instead of trying to understand every single word, which can be overwhelming, she focuses only on the most important words. Nouns, verbs, and prepositions that carry the meaning, like turn left, bank, next street, or traffic light. And just by catching these key words, she is able to follow instructions accurately and reach her destination without stress or confusion. This strategy works in almost every listening situation, from classroom instructions to fast conversations with friends, and the key is to train your brain to pick out words that actually matter for comprehension. You can practice this by listening to short dialogues or real-life audio clips and intentionally ignoring filler words or less important phrases while mentally summarizing the key points aloud. For example, saying, "I need to turn left at the library and then right at the supermarket," which reinforces both your vocabulary and context understanding. Over time, focusing on keywords will help you catch main ideas quickly, improve your ability to follow conversations in real life, and reduce the anxiety that comes from trying to hear every word perfectly. You can also challenge yourself by listening to recordings where some words are unclear or missing, and still practice extracting meaning just from the essential words, which strengthens both listening comprehension and practical thinking skills. Narrating aloud what you hear helps reinforce your memory, pronunciation, and confidence simultaneously. And when you combine this strategy with other listening techniques, like predicting meaning, understanding intonation, and paying attention to context, you create a strong foundation for advanced English listening. Remember, in real life, no one speaks in perfectly clear, slow sentences, so learning to filter the essential information is not only practical but also a huge time saver and confidence booster. And as you practice this method, you'll notice that you can follow fast conversations, understand instructions, and even enjoy English media more naturally, because your brain learns to focus on what matters most. So start now. When listening, ask yourself, what are the key words? Which words tell me what's happening? And repeat those words aloud, summarize their meaning in your own sentences, and notice how much easier understanding English becomes once you train your ear to focus on the essentials. And by consistently applying this secret, you will gradually feel more comfortable in every real-world situation, whether it's navigating a new city, attending a class, or simply chatting with friends. And that is why focusing on keywords is the first crucial secret to advanced English listening. It sets the stage for all the other techniques we're going to explore and helps you feel capable, confident, and ready to understand English naturally in every context. Now let's move on to the second secret, predicting meaning. And this is such a game changer for improving English listening. Imagine a student listening to a news report about environmental issues. And even before the speaker finishes the first sentence, she starts thinking ahead, predicting what might come next. Because she notices keywords like climate change, rising temperatures, and government policies, and from these clues, she anticipates that the next part will likely discuss floods, droughts, or initiatives for sustainability. And this mental prediction makes it so much easier for her to follow the report without getting lost or overwhelmed by the fast pace of speech. The strategy here is to train your brain to always use context clues, prior knowledge, and the flow of conversation to anticipate meaning, so that even if you don't catch every single word, you still understand the overall message. You can practice this by pausing an audio clip after a few sentences, asking yourself, what do I think the speaker will say next? And then play the next section to check whether your prediction was correct. This not only strengthens your inference skills, but also actively engages your mind, because instead of passively hearing words, you are actively thinking ahead, connecting ideas, and preparing for what comes next. And over time, this technique dramatically increases comprehension, because your brain begins to recognize patterns in spoken English, common phrases, and predictable structures, which makes following real conversations, podcasts, or lectures much easier. You can also narrate your predictions aloud, saying things like, I think they will now talk about flooding in coastal areas. Or next, the speaker will probably explain government actions to reduce emissions. And by verbalizing your guesses, you practice speaking, reinforce vocabulary, and solidify understanding. Predicting meaning also helps reduce anxiety while listening, because instead of panicking when a word or phrase is unclear, you rely on context and logic to fill in the gaps, which makes listening smoother and more enjoyable. Whether you're in a classroom, watching the news, or listening to a lecture, this technique allows you to stay ahead of the speaker mentally, follow complex ideas, and participate actively in discussions, because your brain is trained to anticipate, organize, and connect information as it comes. So remember, always look for clues, think about what's coming next, and narrate your predictions aloud. This habit will improve your listening, comprehension, and confidence. And when combined with the first secret, focusing on keywords, predicting meaning ensures that you not only catch the essential information, but also understand the flow and purpose of the conversation, making your English listening more advanced, natural, and effective in real-life situations. And as you practice daily, you'll notice that you are faster, more accurate, and more confident in understanding English at normal or fast speeds. And that is why predicting meaning is such a powerful tool in your listening toolkit. It trains your brain to be proactive, attentive, and engaged, turning every audio or conversation into a chance to understand deeply, anticipate intelligently, and respond naturally, which is exactly what advanced English listeners do. And by consistently applying this strategy, you will gradually feel in control, confident, and capable when listening to real spoken English in any context. Now, let's explore the third secret, understanding intonation, which is one of the most overlooked but incredibly powerful strategies for advanced English listening. Imagine sitting in a classroom while your teacher asks questions, and you notice the way she stresses certain words, uses rising or falling tones, and pauses strategically to indicate emphasis or meaning. For example, when she asks, "Did you finish the assignment?" With a rising tone on you immediately recognize that it is a polite inquiry rather than a criticism, and the stress and pitch changes signal importance, urgency, or subtle meaning beyond the words themselves. Intonation is crucial because native speakers often rely on stress patterns and tone to convey questions, surprise, excitement, or contrast. And if you only focus on the words without paying attention to how they are spoken, you might miss the true meaning or emotional nuance. To practice this, you can listen to short classroom dialogues, podcasts, or interviews and mark which words are stressed, noting whether the tone rises or falls at the end of sentences, and then repeat those sentences aloud exactly as you hear them, mimicking the stress, pitch, and rhythm, which reinforces pronunciation, comprehension, and your ability to recognize subtle cues in speech. For instance, a teacher might say, "You need to submit your homework by Monday," and by listening carefully, you notice the stress on Monday signals a deadline, and you can practice narrating aloud. The teacher emphasized Monday, meaning the deadline is important, which trains your mind to link intonation with meaning and context. Over time, by consistently practicing listening and repeating aloud, you begin to understand when a sentence is a question, a statement, or an exclamation, and you become more adept at detecting nuances like sarcasm, urgency, or politeness, which is extremely useful not only in classrooms but also in conversations, workplace meetings, and casual interactions. You can further enhance your skill by recording yourself repeating the sentences with correct intonation and comparing it to native speakers, ensuring your ear becomes more attuned to stress patterns and pitch changes. Understanding intonation also improves your own speaking, because when you listen attentively to how words are spoken, you naturally incorporate these patterns into your speech, making your English sound more natural and fluent. So, as you practice this strategy, remember to focus not just on what is being said, but how it is said, marking stressed words, repeating sentences aloud, and reflecting on the emotions and emphasis conveyed through tone and over time. Your ability to comprehend advanced English will improve dramatically because you are training your brain to catch both the linguistic and emotional cues in speech, which is exactly what makes listeners sound fluent, confident, and capable of understanding real-life English in any context, whether it's in classrooms, meetings, podcasts, or casual conversations. And that is why understanding intonation is such a critical secret in mastering advanced English listening skills. It allows you to hear the meaning behind the words, grasp the speaker's intent, and respond accurately and naturally. And when combined with the first two secrets, focusing on key words and predicting meaning, you begin to notice that conversations feel less confusing, more intuitive, and much easier to follow. And as you integrate this into your daily listening practice, you'll find yourself naturally picking up stress, rhythm, and tone in every English interaction, enhancing both your comprehension and overall fluency, and ultimately giving you the confidence to understand not just words, but the full meaning, emotion, and intention of everything you hear in English. Now let's move on to the fourth secret: listening for context, which is essential for understanding English even when some words are unfamiliar. Imagine you are sitting in a cafe and overhearing a conversation between two people, and they use a word you've never heard before. But from the way they speak, their gestures, the topic, and the surrounding words, you can infer the meaning. For example, if someone says, "I can't believe the cafe ran out of almond milk again," even if you don't know exactly what almond milk is, the tone, setting, and situation tell you it's a type of drink, and that it's a problem for the person. And this is how context works. You don't always need to understand every word to grasp the main idea. The strategy here is to pay attention to clues in the environment, body language, topic, and sentence structure to fill in gaps in understanding. You can practice this by listening to dialogues with missing words or phrases and trying to guess the meaning from context. Then narrate aloud what you think is being said. For example, "They are talking about a type of milk that the cafe ran out of, and it's important for their order." This not only helps you understand real conversations more effectively, but also trains your brain to make logical connections, use descriptive language, and become comfortable with uncertainty. Because in real-life English, speakers often skip words, use slang, or speak quickly, And by focusing on context, you can still follow along. Over time, this skill allows you to understand news reports, podcasts, or discussions, even when you encounter new vocabulary, because you automatically rely on the surrounding information to decode meaning. Listening for context also improves your ability to summarize and explain what you hear, reinforcing comprehension and active engagement. Narrating your inferences aloud strengthens your vocabulary, descriptive skills, and confidence in using English. Because you're not just passively hearing words, you're actively interpreting meaning and practicing output at the same time. You can further enhance this skill by practicing with movies or shows in English, pausing to predict the meaning of unknown words based on context, then checking if you were correct. And repeating this process regularly trains your mind to listen attentively, process information quickly, and respond accurately in English. So as you practice this technique daily, you'll notice that understanding unfamiliar words or phrases becomes easier. Comprehension improves dramatically, and you start to enjoy conversations, media, and real-life interactions more naturally because your brain learns to rely on context clues, gestures, tone, and surrounding language to create meaning. And that is why listening for context is such a powerful secret. It allows you to understand the essence of what is being said, even if you don't know every single word. And when combined with the first 3 secrets, focusing on key words, predicting meaning, and understanding intonation, you develop a strong, practical foundation for advanced English listening that works in classrooms, cafes, media, and everyday conversations. And by consistently applying this secret, you will gradually feel more confident, capable, and fluent in understanding English naturally and effortlessly. Now let's explore the 5th secret, distinguishing similar sounds, which is crucial for advanced English listening because many learners get confused by words that sound almost the same but have completely different meanings. Imagine a student practicing minimal pairs like ship and sheep or bat and bet, and at first, the difference might seem subtle, almost impossible to detect, especially when native speakers talk quickly. But by focusing carefully on the vowel and consonant sounds, she begins to notice the slight differences, such as the short I in ship versus the long E in sheep, or the short A in bat versus the short E in bet. And by repeating these words aloud, listening carefully to the pronunciation, and even writing them down, she reinforces her ear for subtle distinctions while improving her speaking accuracy at the same time. The strategy here is to pay close attention to the mouth movement, tongue placement, and duration of sounds because small differences can completely change the meaning. And practicing minimal pairs helps train your brain to pick up these nuances naturally in real conversations, lectures, or media. You can practice by listening to audio recordings that highlight these pairs, pausing to repeat, mimicking the sounds exactly, and even recording yourself to compare with native pronunciation, which improves both listening discrimination and pronunciation accuracy. Over time, your ability to hear these subtle differences will dramatically increase, so that when you hear someone say ship or sheep in a sentence, you immediately understand which word they mean without having to rely on context alone. This skill is especially helpful in conversations where mishearing a word can completely change the meaning. And by actively narrating and repeating these words aloud, you also reinforce vocabulary, spelling, and confidence in speaking. For example, you can say, "The ship is sailing fast," and "the sheep are grazing in the field," making sure you clearly pronounce the vowel differences each time, which trains your ear to detect and produce the correct sounds consistently. This technique not only improves listening accuracy but also sharpens overall English comprehension because you become more sensitive to pronunciation, intonation, and subtle differences in speech, which are all critical for advanced learners. So consistently practicing minimal pairs, focusing on subtle sounds, repeating them aloud, and writing them down allows you to develop precise listening skills, recognize words accurately in real-time conversation, and feel confident even when native speakers speak quickly or with different accents. And when combined with the previous secrets, focusing on keywords, predicting meaning, understanding intonation, and listening for context, you create a strong foundation for listening fluently, understanding every detail, and confidently engaging in advanced English conversations, making The Secret a powerful tool to sharpen your auditory skills, pronunciation, and comprehension in natural English communication. Now let's move on to the sixth secret, active listening techniques, which is all about engaging your mind fully while listening. Because passive hearing is never enough if you want to develop advanced English listening skills. Imagine a professional participating in a Zoom call where the client is explaining multiple project requirements at a fast pace, and instead of just nodding silently, she actively takes notes, mentally summarizes key points, and even repeats critical information silently or aloud, such as the client wants 3 changes: add visuals, update statistics, and adjust formatting, and this engagement keeps her focused, reduces misunderstandings, and ensures she fully comprehends every instruction. The strategy here is to treat listening like an active skill, not a passive one, which means taking notes of important words or phrases, summarizing what you hear in your own words, asking yourself questions about the content, and even paraphrasing aloud whenever possible. You can practice this by listening to short dialogues or meeting recordings and pausing after each section to summarize the main ideas aloud. For example, saying, "The speaker mentioned that the deadline is next Friday, and we need to finalize the design by Wednesday," which reinforces comprehension, memory retention, and vocabulary simultaneously. Active listening also involves mental engagement, like predicting what the speaker might say next, connecting ideas to previous points and reflecting on the implications, and narrating your thoughts aloud during practice trains both your listening and speaking fluency. Over time, this habit improves not only your ability to capture information accurately, but also your confidence in real-life conversations, presentations, or professional settings, because your mind is trained to focus, organize, and process spoken English efficiently. Additionally, when you actively engage while listening, you are better able to notice tone, stress, and emphasis, which provides subtle cues about importance, urgency, or emotional content, and summarizing key points aloud, or mentally reinforces these aspects. You can enhance this skill further by reviewing your notes, checking for accuracy, and practicing repetition, which consolidates understanding and ensures you retain information for longer periods. For example, after listening to a short dialogue, you might narrate aloud. The customer prefers a quick response, expects a detailed report, and emphasize the importance of visuals in the presentation, which trains your brain to filter critical information and express it clearly in your own words. This combination of listening attentively, summarizing aloud, and mentally engaging with content helps bridge comprehension and expression. And when paired with previous secrets, focusing on keywords, predicting meaning, understanding intonation, listening for context, and distinguishing similar sounds, you build a powerful, interconnected set of skills that makes advanced English listening easier and more natural. So consistently practicing active listening techniques will not only improve your comprehension, retention, and vocabulary, but will also enhance your confidence to follow conversations, take part in discussions, and respond accurately, whether it's in meetings, classrooms, podcasts, or daily interactions. And by turning listening into an active, intentional practice, you'll notice remarkable improvements in your overall English fluency, making this secret a cornerstone of becoming a skilled, confident, and engaged English listener. Now let's explore the seventh secret, handling fast speech. Because in real life, English is rarely spoken slowly and clearly, and advanced listeners need strategies to follow along effortlessly, even when people talk quickly. Imagine a group of friends chatting rapidly about weekend plans, mentioning movies, parties, and meetups all at once, and at first, it might feel overwhelming as words blend together and your brain struggles to keep up. But instead of panicking or trying to catch every single word, focus on familiar phrases like movie night, meet at 6, or bring snacks, which act as anchors to understand the main ideas of the conversation. The strategy here is to identify and latch onto key phrases first, allowing your brain to process meaning gradually while filling in additional words as you become more comfortable. You can practice this by listening to fast dialogues in podcasts, TV shows, or recorded conversations, pausing when necessary, Summarizing aloud the main ideas you caught, for example, saying, "They are planning to meet at 6 for a movie and bring snacks for everyone," which trains your mind to filter important information quickly, prioritize comprehension, and build mental speed for processing spoken English. Over time, as you repeatedly practice listening to fast speech, your brain starts recognizing patterns, common expressions, and sentence structures, allowing you to understand faster without needing to slow down the speaker or translate everything mentally. This method also helps you develop fluency and confidence, because once you are able to catch familiar phrases and build meaning from context, the conversation becomes easier to follow and much less stressful, even if some words are unclear. Additionally, narrating what you understood aloud reinforces comprehension, pronunciation, and active engagement, and it allows you to check whether you correctly interpreted the message. For example, saying aloud, "I understand they are meeting on Saturday evening for a movie, and everyone will bring something to share," which strengthens both listening and speaking simultaneously. Practicing this technique regularly improves processing speed, phrase recognition, and overall fluency. And when combined with previous secrets like focusing on keywords, predicting meaning, understanding intonation, listening for context, distinguishing similar sounds, and active listening, handling fast speech becomes manageable and even enjoyable. The key is consistent practice, patience, and not getting discouraged by initial confusion, because each time you focus on key phrases, summarize main ideas, and repeat aloud, your brain becomes faster and more accurate at decoding rapid English speech. Ultimately, mastering fast speech allows you to participate confidently in real conversations, follow podcasts or news reports without frustration, and engage naturally in both professional and casual settings. And this secret is crucial for anyone aiming to become an advanced, fluent, and confident English listener, capable of understanding English as it is truly spoken in real life. Now let's dive into the 8th secret, understanding accents. Because English is spoken in so many different ways around the world, and advanced listeners need strategies to comprehend multiple accents naturally. Imagine a traveler at an airport listening to announcements and conversations from people speaking British, American, and Australian English, and noticing how the same words sound slightly different depending on the accent. For example, the word schedule might be pronounced schedule in American English, schedule in British English, and slightly differently in Australian English. And words like tomato, water, and dance also have subtle pronunciation changes that could cause confusion if you are not familiar with them. The strategy here is exposure and active practice. Listen to multiple accents regularly, pay attention to how vowel and consonant sounds differ, and try to mimic them aloud, because repetition and imitation help your brain adapt to variations in pronunciation and intonation. You can practice by listening to recordings, narrating the meaning aloud, and repeating sentences exactly as you hear them. For instance, saying aloud, "The British speaker said, 'The meeting is scheduled for 3 p.m., and I understand the time and context,' or, 'The Australian speaker mentioned the train arrives at platform 5, which reinforces both comprehension and pronunciation. This practice not only improves your ability to understand different accents, but also trains your ear to recognize patterns in speech, making listening more flexible and adaptable in real-life situations, whether you are on a trip, attending a meeting, or watching a TV show. Exposure to varied accents also strengthens your confidence because you know that even if a speaker pronounces words differently from what you learned in textbooks, you can still understand the meaning through attentive listening, context clues, and phonetic awareness. Over time, by consistently practicing, you'll notice that understanding foreign or regional accents becomes easier. You make fewer errors in comprehension, and you can engage in conversations without needing repetition or clarification. Narrating what you hear aloud, imitating intonation and pronunciation, and checking for meaning are crucial steps in solidifying this skill, because active engagement ensures that your brain adapts to variations in speech rather than being surprised or confused. When combined with previous listening secrets like focusing on key words, predicting meaning, understanding intonation, listening for context, distinguishing similar sounds, active listening, and handling fast speech, mastering accents completes a critical layer of advanced listening skills, allowing you to follow English spoken naturally in diverse environments, adapt to different speakers, and maintain confidence in real-time communication. So remember, consistent exposure, imitation, and active reflection on multiple accents will make your English comprehension more flexible, accurate, and fluent. And this secret is essential for anyone aiming to become an advanced, confident, and skilled English listener capable of understanding English anywhere in the world. Now let's move on to the 9th secret, listening with purpose, which is about training your brain to focus on specific goals while listening, because active, goal-oriented listening dramatically improves comprehension, retention, and fluency. Imagine a student listening to a podcast specifically to identify phrasal verbs, such as look up to, run out of, or take after. And instead of passively hearing every word, she sets a clear goal. I will focus on finding and noting all phrasal verbs in this episode, which allows her mind to filter information and pay attention to relevant content. The strategy here is simple but powerful. Before you start listening, decide exactly what you want to extract from the audio, whether it's key vocabulary, numbers, idioms, or main ideas, and keep that goal in mind throughout. As she listens, she mentally highlights every phrasal verb, pauses if necessary, and narrates her findings aloud, saying, I heard look up to in the first minute, run out of when discussing groceries, and take after in the story about family, which reinforces comprehension, vocabulary retention, and active engagement simultaneously. You can practice this by choosing any short audio clip, setting a clear target, such as listening for adjectives, time expressions or opinions, and writing or speaking aloud the results, which trains your brain to focus, filter irrelevant information, and extract what matters. Listening with purpose also helps reduce anxiety and increases confidence because you are not overwhelmed by every word spoken. Instead, your brain is selective, attentive, and proactive in capturing essential information. Over time, this technique improves your ability to comprehend complex conversations, follow lectures, understand podcasts, and participate actively in discussions. Because you are constantly practicing focused attention, making connections, and reinforcing memory of the target language. By narrating what you extract aloud, you also practice speaking, pronunciation, and sentence formation, which builds multiple skills at once. Combining this secret with the previous strategies, focusing on keywords, predicting meaning, understanding intonation, listening for context, distinguishing similar sounds, active listening, handling fast speech, and understanding accents, creates a robust, comprehensive listening approach that allows you to understand, interpret, and respond accurately in real-world English situations. So remember, before every listening session, set a clear purpose. Concentrate on the information you need. Narrate your findings aloud and review them if necessary, because this intentional practice not only improves comprehension, but also trains your brain to listen actively, think critically, and retain vocabulary effectively. And by consistently applying listening with purpose, you'll notice that your English listening becomes sharper, faster, and more accurate, making every conversation, podcast, lecture, or media experience more productive, enjoyable, and confidence-boosting. Now let's dive into the 10th and final secret. Reflect and repeat, which is one of the most effective ways to solidify advanced English listening skills, because repetition and reflection turn passive listening into active learning and dramatically improve memory retention, comprehension, and fluency. Imagine a student listening to a TED Talk on innovation for the first time, and even though she understands parts of it, there are words, phrases, and idioms that she doesn't catch completely, so she listens a second and then a third time, each round actively noting new expressions, vocabulary, and sentence structures, and narrating reflections aloud, saying things like, the speaker said sustainable development, creative problem solving, and collaborative innovation, and I noticed that these ideas are connected to teamwork and progress. And by doing this, she engages her brain on multiple levels, listening, analyzing, summarizing, and reproducing, which strengthens comprehension and memory simultaneously. The strategy here is simple but powerful. After listening, pause to reflect, write down or say aloud new words, idioms, or expressions, and summarize what you heard in your own sentences, repeating this cycle multiple times, because each repetition reinforces pronunciation, meaning, and sentence patterns, making your listening more precise and your output more fluent. You can practice this with any speech, podcast, or audio clip by listening in layers. First for main ideas, then for details, then for vocabulary and phrases, and narrating everything aloud to yourself, which consolidates understanding and builds confidence in comprehension. This technique also trains your brain to catch subtleties like emphasis, intonation, and rhythm, which are essential for understanding native speakers in natural conversation. Over time, consistently reflecting and repeating allows you to internalize expressions, idioms, and pronunciation patterns, making your listening more automatic and less dependent on conscious effort. Additionally, by combining this secret with the previous 9, focusing on keywords, predicting meaning, understanding intonation, listening for context, distinguishing similar sounds, active listening, handling fast speech, understanding accents, and listening with purpose, you create a comprehensive, layered approach to advanced listening that is practical, efficient, and highly effective for real-world English. By practicing reflect and repeat, you not only improve your comprehension, but also your ability to reproduce English accurately in speech and writing, because narrating and summarizing aloud links listening with output, which is essential for fluency. So after every listening session, take time to replay the audio, note new language, narrate what you understood, and reflect on your learning, because repetition is the key to mastery. And through this consistent, layered practice, your listening skills will become sharper, your vocabulary richer, and your confidence higher, allowing you to follow fast, accented, or complex English effortlessly. And this final secret completes the toolkit for advanced English listening, empowering you to turn every conversation, lecture, podcast, or media experience into an active, productive, and fluency-building opportunity. And by making reflect and repeat a daily habit, you'll notice continuous improvement, deeper understanding, and greater ease in both comprehension and communication. And that is why this secret is essential for anyone who wants to master English listening at an advanced level, achieve natural fluency, and fully engage with the language in every real-life situation. And now, as we reach the conclusion of this journey, let's take a moment to recap the 10 powerful secrets to advanced English listening skills that we've explored together today. Because remembering and reinforcing these strategies is essential for mastering English comprehension and fluency. First, focus on key words to catch the essential meaning without getting overwhelmed by every single word. Second, predict meaning by anticipating what will be said next, using context and prior knowledge. Third, understand intonation so you can grasp the speaker's intent, emotions, and emphasis beyond just the words. Fourth, listen for context to infer meaning when encountering unfamiliar words or phrases. Fifth, distinguish similar sounds by paying attention to minimal pairs and subtle pronunciation differences. Sixth, practice active listening techniques by summarizing key points aloud, taking notes, and mentally engaging with the content. Seventh, handle fast speech by focusing on familiar phrases, gradually catching more words, and summarizing main ideas. Eighth, understand accents by exposing yourself to multiple English accents, mimicking them aloud, and practicing comprehension in diverse contexts. Ninth, listen with purpose by setting clear goals for each listening session and extracting targeted information. And 10th, reflect and repeat by replaying audio, noting new vocabulary, narrating summaries aloud, and consolidating learning for long-term fluency. As you think about these 10 strategies, remember that learning English is not passive. It is an active, daily practice that requires attention, reflection, repetition, and application in real-life situations. I encourage you to implement these strategies consistently. Listen to podcasts, watch movies or news in English, participate in conversations, summarize what you hear aloud, and reflect on your progress. Because each time you practice, you are building stronger comprehension, sharper listening skills, and greater confidence in your abilities. Over time, these small daily steps accumulate, transforming your understanding of spoken English from hesitant and uncertain to fluent, natural, and effortless. And you'll notice yourself picking up nuances, interpreting meaning, following fast speech, and even understanding speakers with different accents without stress. The most important part is to stay motivated and patient, because progress may feel gradual at first, but persistence, combined with these 10 secrets, leads to remarkable improvement. By committing to active listening, predicting meaning, paying attention to intonation, using context, distinguishing sounds, practicing actively, handling fast speech, recognizing accents, listening purposefully, and reflecting and repeating, you are setting yourself up for lifelong fluency in English. And as you continue applying these techniques, you will not only improve comprehension, but also expand vocabulary, enhance pronunciation, and gain the confidence to participate fully in conversations, classrooms, professional settings, and daily interactions. So take a deep breath, embrace the journey, and remind yourself that mastery of English listening is achievable for everyone willing to practice, reflect, and engage consistently. And I want to leave you with this thought. Every conversation, every podcast, every lecture, and every media experience is an opportunity to apply these 10 secrets. And the more you immerse yourself, the faster your listening comprehension, fluency, and confidence will grow. Finally, don't forget to like this video. Subscribe to English Insight for more tips and strategies. Comment below with your favorite listening practice or secret you are excited to try. And most importantly, actively implement these strategies every day, because your journey toward natural, effortless, and confident English listening starts now. And with dedication, patience, and consistent practice, you have the power to transform your comprehension, fluency, and communication forever, turning English from a challenge into an enjoyable skill that opens doors to new opportunities, experiences, and personal growth. Remember, fluency is a process. Confidence is built one step at a time, and mastery of advanced listening is within your reach. So go ahead, practice actively, immerse yourself in English, reflect, repeat, and watch your skills flourish, because with the 10 secrets you've learned today, you are now equipped to listen, understand, and engage with English at a whole new level. And English Insight will continue to guide, inspire, and motivate you every step of the way.